That black woman has no business being on this plane. Eleanor van der Linde shouted, pointing directly at a black woman sitting opposite her. People like her are always causing trouble. I don't know how she even got on this flight, but I'm not setting foot on this plane until she's arrested and removed. She's obviously trying to sneak her way into first class because she clearly doesn't belong there. Eleanor, a white woman with an air of aristocracy, continued her tirade. Her meticulously manicured fingers tightened around the strap of her designer handbag, her face contorted with disgust, her angry eyes blazing with self-righteousness, her voice echoing throughout the boarding gate. The airport was bustling, filled with weary travelers eager to board their flights, but her voice cut through the noise like a knife. Curious eyes turned towards her, conversations ceased. Some passengers exchanged glances, hesitant, unsure whether to intervene or look away. Others watched with interest, silently forming their own opinions. Standing in the center of the commotion was a young woman named Serena Bellwether, a black woman. Serena didn't need to raise her voice, she didn't need to argue or prove anything. Her mere presence spoke volumes, indicating that Eleanor had just made a grave mistake. As we explore this story together, please let us know where you're watching from in the comments and hit the subscribe button if you stand against injustice and wrongful treatment. Serena Bellwether is an elegant, intelligent, composed and radiantly beautiful black woman who has built her success through resilience, not privilege. However, to the untrained eye, to those blinded by their own prejudices, she was just an ordinary passenger. And that's exactly what others were doing, checking their luggage, boarding passes, making last-minute phone calls before stepping onto the plane. And then Eleanor van der Linde stood at the head of the line, scanning the crowd, her sharp eyes moving with an air of superiority. She saw Serena Bellwether. A simple outfit, no designer labels, no expensive jewelry, no visible display of wealth. In Eleanor's eyes, Serena didn't belong. She barely glanced at Serena's face, her mind already made up. She was certain she had just spotted an employee who had no right to be in this line. So, without hesitation, without a second thought, without even asking a single question, Eleanor ordered, "You there." Serena turned, maintaining a neutral expression. "Take these bags and load them properly and be careful, I don't want any scratches on my luggage." Eleanor's tone left no room for doubt, only expectation. Passengers nearby paused their conversations, some exchanging glances, others looking away. No one spoke up, no one corrected her. And Serena, she didn't react as Eleanor expected. No hesitation, no confusion, no awkward fumbling. She simply looked at Eleanor, her expression unreadable, and then she smiled. "I'm a passenger just like you." Her tone was calm, even unbothered. Eleanor's face twisted in disbelief, she let out a short, dry laugh. "Oh come on, we both know that's not true." Serena didn't respond, she simply held her ticket in hand, waiting. Eleanor's annoyance turned to impatience. She took a step closer, lowering her voice but not its venom. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull here, but you're in the wrong line." And in true Eleanor fashion, she did what she always did when she wanted something handled. She called an employee. Her hand shot up, and within seconds a flight attendant approached. Sarah Young, professional and visibly tense at being dragged into whatever was happening, asked, "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Eleanor let out an exasperated sigh, gesturing towards Serena as if discussing a misplaced item. "Yes, actually there is a problem." Passengers nearby pretended not to hear, but their ears were still perked. Eleanor continued speaking as if Serena wasn't even there. "This woman is trying to board first class. I don't know how she got here, but I think she's confused." Sarah blinked, glancing between Serena's composed expression and Eleanor's unwavering arrogance. She turned to Serena. "Ma'am, do you have your boarding pass?" Serena wordlessly handed her boarding pass over. Sarah scanned the barcode, checked the seat number, looked at Serena again, then turned back to Eleanor. "She's a first-class passenger, ma'am. Everything checks out." Sarah was a young professional, but visibly nervous. She recognized Eleanor instantly. The kind of frequent flyer who demanded extra perks, filed unnecessary complaints, and expected the world to bend to her will. "Ma'am, every passenger here has been properly screened. If she's in this line, she has the right to be here." Eleanor let out a dramatic, exasperated laugh. "You've got to be kidding me? Well, that just doesn't make sense." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah tightened her grip on the scanner, her discomfort clear. "Ma'am, I assure you her seat is in first class. Everything is in order." Eleanor crossed her arms. "No, I don't think it is. I want to speak to a supervisor." Sarah hesitated, she could already feel the weight of the situation. There's no need for that, ma'am. She's a confirmed first-class passenger. If you'll excuse us, we need to continue boarding. Eleanor stiffened. Sarah had cut off her authority, denied her the power she was used to having, and that was unacceptable. But before she could snap back, before she could make an even bigger scene, she noticed something. The other passengers, they were watching, and now it wasn't just unease in their faces, it was judgment. Not towards Serena, towards her. Eleanor hated being embarrassed even more than she hated being wrong. So, with a sharp inhale, she forced a tight smile. Fine. Her voice was clipped, sharp, but she backed down at least for now. And as Serena turned to board the plane, unfazed, untouched by Eleanor's privileged fury, Eleanor watched her, observing and waiting. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Eleanor Vanderlyn wasn't the type to let things go. She was going to make sure Serena regretted this moment and the next and the next. Have you ever been in a situation where you were treated unfairly? What did you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe because this story is just beginning. Eleanor Vanderlyn stepped onto the plane, her frustration barely concealed beneath her forced tight-lipped smile. She had just been humiliated at the boarding gate, and she was still seething with anger. She had expected Serena to back down, to step aside as so many others had done before when confronted with her authority. But instead, Serena simply stood there, unshaken, untouched by Eleanor's words. Now, as Eleanor moved through the first-class cabin, her eyes scanned the seating arrangement, searching for her assigned seat. When she found it, her stomach twisted into a tight knot. She stopped abruptly, her face paled, then immediately darkened with fury. She was seated right next to Serena Bellwether. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, staring at the seat as if it had personally offended her. Then, before she could stop herself, she let out a dramatic huff, loud enough for everyone around her to hear. Absolutely not, she snapped. I refuse to sit here. Passengers turned their heads at the sudden outburst. A flight attendant, sensing trouble, hurried over, her forced smile barely masking the tension in her eyes. Is there a problem, ma'am? Eleanor crossed her arms tightly, her fingers digging into her sleeves. Yes, there is a problem, she said, jerking her head towards Serena. For her part, Serena didn't even react. She was already seated, adjusting her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her, her expression calm as if Eleanor wasn't even worth acknowledging. The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the blatant hostility. Ma'am, these are the assigned seats. We can't make last-minute changes unless there's an available alternative. Eleanor let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, I think you can make an exception. There is no way I'm spending this flight next to. She stopped herself, her eyes darting towards Serena, before she could finish her sentence. Finally, Serena looked up, raising a single eyebrow, waiting. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset, she wasn't flustered. She just watched, quiet, patient, unbothered. That made Eleanor even angrier. The flight attendant, growing more uncomfortable, spoke again, keeping her tone measured. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but we're fully booked. We don't have any open seats in first class. Eleanor's lips thinned, she turned towards the other passengers, scanning the cabin as if expecting someone to volunteer to trade seats. Silence. Passengers quickly busied themselves with their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, avoiding eye contact. No one wanted to get involved in this. Eleanor wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being ignored. Her anger flared even hotter. There has to be another seat. I cannot sit here, she insisted. The flight attendant hesitated, then said softly, let me check with the crew. Eleanor folded her arms tighter, her nails digging into her skin, watching as the flight attendant disappeared towards the front of the cabin. Serena exhaled slowly, refocusing on her bag, adjusting her belongings with a kind of patience that made Eleanor's blood boil. How could she just sit there, unbothered, while Eleanor was being so obviously inconvenienced? Moments later, the flight attendant returned, offering an apologetic look. I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I said, the flight is full. There are no other available first-class seats. Eleanor's eyes flashed with irritation. That's unacceptable. She turned towards the other passengers, louder this time, her voice filled with exasperation. Someone switch with me, please. Anyone. Again, silence. Passengers pretended not to hear her, looking out the window, scrolling through their phones, suddenly interested in anything but the entitled woman demanding a seat change. Just when it seemed like no one would step up, a voice spoke, I'll switch. Eleanor turned sharply. Across the aisle, A middle-aged man with warm eyes and a calm demeanor met her gaze. He was dressed in a navy suit, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant's shoulders sagged in relief. "That would be very helpful, sir." Thank you very much." Eleanor straightened, a smug smirk creeping onto her face. Of course someone had finally given in. People always did, eventually. The man stood up, gathering his belongings. Eleanor wasted no time, snatching her carry-on from the overhead bin and sliding into her new seat, as far away from Serena as possible. Once settled, she allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. Her body relaxed into the cushioned seat. She had won again, or so she thought. Serena remained as composed as ever, turning her attention back to her belongings, preparing for the flight as if nothing had happened. Eleanor clenched her jaw, but she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The tension between Serena and Eleanor had settled into something cold and unspoken. It wasn't loud anymore, but a simmering hostility beneath the surface, the kind that didn't need words. Eleanor had made it clear she wanted Serena gone, removed, erased from her presence entirely. But Serena, she wasn't there to fight for space that already belonged to her. The final boarding announcements played over the intercom as passengers made their last-minute adjustments, slipping their carry-ons into the overhead bins before settling into their seats. Serena stood, reaching for her luggage. The overhead bin above her seat was already packed, filled with suitcases from early boarders. She didn't make a fuss, didn't sigh in frustration, didn't even hesitate. Instead, she scanned the cabin for a nearby compartment with room. It didn't take long to spot a nearly empty bin directly across from her seat. The only problem was it was directly above Eleanor van der Linde. Serena took a breath before stepping forward, lifting her carry-on with ease. It was a logical choice, there was ample space and the bins were shared. It was nothing more than a practical solution to a minor inconvenience. But just as she was about to place her bag inside, a sudden forceful movement stopped her. Eleanor's hand shot out, snatching Serena's suitcase from her grip, yanking it down with unnecessary force. The bag slammed onto the floor with a loud, jarring thud. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads, eyes widening at the sudden aggression. Some whispered, others sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. The energy shifted instantly. Eleanor stood up, her face twisted in disgust, eyes blazing with something ugly. "Absolutely not," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "You are not putting your things near me." Serena blinked, staring at Eleanor with an unreadable expression. Slowly, deliberately she bent down, picked up her bag and dusted it off. Her composure didn't waver. She didn't lash out, didn't retaliate. She simply stood tall, adjusting the strap of her carry-on with quiet patience. "Amanda," she said, her voice level but firm, "this is a shared cabin. Overhead bins don't belong to individual passengers." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, her breathing grew heavier, more erratic. "I don't care," she spat. "I don't want your things anywhere near me." Serena let out a slow breath. "I'm just putting my luggage away, that's all." But Eleanor wasn't listening, she was spiraling because Serena wasn't backing down and Eleanor couldn't stand that. "No!" Eleanor suddenly shrieked. Before anyone could process what was happening, she grabbed Serena's carry-on with both hands and hurled it forward, violently aggressive, like she was disposing of something filthy. The suitcase hit the ground with another heavy thud. Louder gasps echoed through the cabin. Passengers sat in stunned silence. A woman across the aisle put a hand over her mouth in shock. The energy in the cabin had shifted even further, it was no longer just discomfort but disbelief. But Eleanor wasn't done. Serena bent down once more, retrieving her bag, her patience now wearing thin. She didn't argue, didn't shout, she simply reached for the handle. And that's when Eleanor did the unthinkable. With a furious shriek, Eleanor snatched the suitcase again, and this time she threw it off the plane. Passengers sat frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Serena's carry-on tumbled through the open boarding door, landing with a heavy thud on the jet bridge below. An astonished flight attendant who had just been returning to the cabin, stopped mid-step, her jaw slack. But Eleanor, she didn't feel remorse, didn't feel shame. If anything, the sight of Serena standing there, still calm, still composed, still refusing to react the way Eleanor wanted her to, infuriated her even more. Because Eleanor wanted a scene, she wanted Serena to break, she wanted to see her flustered, humiliated, defeated. Yet Serena just stood there, unshaken. If you were in Serena's shoes, what would you have done at this point? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to click the subscribe button now. That was the final straw. Something inside Eleanor snapped. With a growl of frustration, she lunged forward. "You need to move," she snapped, pushing her hands towards Serena, attempting to shove her out of the way. But she was done with the silence. Before Eleanor's hands could make contact, Serena's arms shot up, her grip firm as she caught Eleanor by the wrists, stopping her mid-motion. The shift in power was immediate. Eleanor's entire demeanor changed, her eyes widened, realizing too late that she had gone too far. She was no longer in control. Serena's fingers held Eleanor's wrists firmly but not forcefully. She wasn't attacking her, she was stopping her. But Eleanor's face contorted into something vicious. She yanked at Serena's grip, and her voice rose to a shriek. "Let me go. You're hurting me." Her sudden outburst was loud enough to be heard across the cabin, and that's when the supervisor came rushing in, eyes wide, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. "What's going on here?" Eleanor didn't miss a beat, she immediately switched tactics. Her entire body trembled, and her voice turned high-pitched, desperate, playing the victim flawlessly. "She attacked me," Eleanor wailed, pointing at Serena with a dramatic, shaking hand. "She grabbed me. She got violent. I was just defending myself. That's why I threw her bag out. She was threatening me." Serena, still composed, slowly released Eleanor's wrists. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes now. "That's not true," Serena said. The supervisor looked between them, clearly trying to process what had just happened. "Hold on, let's slow down for a second," she said, her voice uncertain. "Miss Sinclair, did you?" Eleanor cut her off before she could even finish. "She's violent," she shouted, her voice shrill with manufactured fear. "She needs to be removed from this plane. Arrest her." However, Serena said nothing. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself because she didn't need to. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane, their expressions unreadable as they approached the first-class cabin. The entire plane fell into a tense silence. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first. "We've been informed there was an incident involving a disruptive passenger," he said, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Eleanor, who was still playing the part of the terrified victim, hands shaking for dramatic effect. "Yes, officer." Eleanor blurted out, her voice breathless, trembling. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Serena. "She threatened me. She got violent. She grabbed me. I don't feel safe sitting here." Serena remained still, her expression entirely unreadable. The security officer turned towards her, his expression neutral but firm. "Ma'am, is that true?" The weight of Eleanor's accusation hung heavy in the air as the security officer stood in front of Serena's seat. Passengers sat frozen, the tension thick enough to suffocate the entire cabin. Serena, still poised, still refusing to shrink under the scrutiny, sat with her hands resting on her lap, watching everything unfold. However, Eleanor was far from calm. The moment she saw security step in, her confidence surged back. She straightened her posture, her breath still uneven from her fake tears, and turned her full attention to them, her allies. "She's aggressive," Eleanor exclaimed again, her voice pitched just right, carefully wavering to sell her act. "She grabbed me and she wouldn't stop. I was terrified. That's why I had to defend myself." It was a masterful performance and it was working. The security officer nodded firmly, his expression serious as he looked back at Serena. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." A few passengers gasped audibly, others shifted uncomfortably, their faces twisting in disbelief. Some who had missed parts of the argument earlier now assumed the worst. Serena remained silent, she didn't argue, didn't plead her case because she knew something Eleanor didn't. The lead security officer gestured for Serena to stand. "We're going to need to remove you from this flight, ma'am." Eleanor folded her arms, her expression smug now. She had won, or so she thought, because just as the security officer reached for his radio to call for backup to remove Serena from the plane, a new voice cut through the air like a blade. "That won't be necessary." The entire cabin went still, heads turned, and there, stepping onto the plane with effortless authority, was a sharply dressed airline executive. Behind him stood 2 more high-ranking officials, their expressions unreadable, but their presence alone sent a shockwave through the first-class cabin. A thick, uncomfortable silence settled over the first-class cabin, and the presence of the airline executives had already turned the entire situation upside down, but what happened next would change everything. The lead executive, a man whose very posture radiated authority, stepped forward, his sharp eyes shifting from the security officers to Serena. Then with a calm, steady voice, he spoke the words that would make the entire plane hold its breath. Miss Sinclair, I deeply apologize. We had no idea you were on this flight. Gasps rippled through the cabin, passengers sat up straighter, eyes widening, some exchanged shocked glances, others simply stared, trying to process what they had just heard. But the most notable reaction was Amanda Van der Lin's. Her face went ghostly pale, her posture stiffened, she felt a cold sweat creep up her spine, because that name rang in her ears like a warning bell. Miss Sinclair. She swallowed hard. Wait, what? Amanda stammered, looking between Serena and the executive. Miss Sinclair, what? Who is she? The executive's gaze snapped towards Amanda, and for the first time since she boarded this flight, Amanda felt something she wasn't used to feeling: fear. His expression was stone cold. You just harassed and attempted to remove the CEO and chief board member of this airline from her own flight. Dead silence. Amanda's heart stopped. Passengers erupted into hushed whispers, turning towards Serena with fresh, stunned expressions. Board member? She owns this airline? No way. Oh my God, she's literally the CEO. Amanda's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her thoughts were scrambling for an escape, a justification, an excuse, but nothing came. She had spent the last hour trying to assert her power over a woman who had more power than she could ever dream of, and now everyone knew it. Eleanor felt the eyes on her, not in admiration, not in sympathy, but in judgment. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now fully engaged. People who had quietly agreed with Eleanor's behavior were now pretending they hadn't, because nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of history. Eleanor's breath was shaky as she desperately tried to regain control. I didn't know, she blurted out, her voice suddenly smaller, weaker. I thought. But before she could finish, Serena stood. For the first time since Eleanor tried to push her, since Eleanor lied, since Eleanor threw her bag off the plane, Serena rose from her seat with absolute control. Then she looked Eleanor directly in the eye. The entire plane was watching, and Serena said only one thing: that's exactly the problem. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, Serena's gaze never wavered. You didn't know, but you assumed. A hush fell over the cabin. Those words sank deep, not just into Eleanor, but into everyone who had stood by, remained silent, or agreed with her. Because that was it, that was the truth Eleanor had spent her entire life avoiding. Eleanor wasn't wrong because she didn't know who Serena was, she was wrong because she assumed that Serena was less than her. She assumed she didn't belong, and now she was paying for it. Eleanor's lips trembled. She wasn't the one in control anymore, she wasn't the one who got to decide how this ended, she wasn't the one who had power in this room. Eleanor's voice cracked, she swallowed, her fake confidence completely shattered. I didn't mean to, please, can we just... Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. I made a mistake. But no one defended her, not the passengers, not the flight attendants, not even the security officers, who now looked at her differently. Eleanor Van der Lin, for the first time in her life, was completely alone. The lead security officer sighed and took a step forward, his voice professional but firm. Ms. Whitmore, you will be removed from this flight immediately. Eleanor snapped her head towards him, panic surging in her chest. What? No, you can't do that. She turned to Serena, frantic now. Tell them, please. I swear I didn't. But Serena didn't say another word because she didn't need to. Eleanor's own actions had already spoken for her. The flight attendant, who had originally been hesitant, now stood with quiet satisfaction. She wouldn't be defending Eleanor either. The whispers among the passengers turned into murmurs of approval. Yeah, get her out of here. This is what she deserves. I'm embarrassed I didn't say something earlier. Security reached for Eleanor's arm, and that's when it all fell apart. No. This isn't fair. I'm the victim here. Eleanor shrieked, her voice rising in desperation, but it didn't matter. The entire first-class cabin watched as Eleanor Van der Lin, who once held herself so high, so untouchable, so above everyone else, was now being escorted off the flight. Passengers began clapping, the sound of cheering rang through the cabin. Eleanor was still screaming, still trying to control a situation she had already lost, but now nobody was listening. And as she disappeared from sight, Serena exhaled slowly and sat back down. The flight attendant approached carefully, her voice softer this time. Miss Sinclair, is there anything we can do to make this right? Serena, still composed, shook her head with a small smile. No, I think the lesson has already been taught. The murmurs in the cabin turned into quiet respect, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, the plane finally felt peaceful. Eleanor Van der Lin had always believed she was untouchable, She had walked through life believing that the rules did not apply to her, that she could push boundaries, demand special treatment, and get away with behavior others would be punished for. But today that illusion had crumbled, and it was crumbling even further the moment she was dragged off the plane, kicking and screaming. Eleanor thought the worst was over, that she could salvage the situation somehow, that she could complain to the right people, demand a refund, call her lawyer, anything to make this go away. She was wrong. A voice called out, "Ms. Whitmore." Eleanor turned sharply, her head snapping towards the sound of her name. And there, waiting for her, standing tall in a tailored suit, was the lead airline executive. He held a folder in one hand, a neutral yet cold expression on his face. Eleanor's stomach clenched. The airline wasn't about to let her walk away without consequences. Eleanor straightened her posture, summoning the last of her bravado. She smoothed her blouse, lifted her chin, and plastered on a smug expression. "Oh, finally," she huffed, placing a hand on her hip. "I need to file a complaint about that entire ordeal. I was mistreated. No, I was harassed on that plane." The executive didn't blink, didn't react, didn't even seem remotely interested in what she had to say. Instead, he extended the folder to her. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice cool, emotionless, final, "effective immediately, you are permanently banned from all future flights on this airline." Eleanor froze for a moment, her brain refused to process the words, her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. She felt the world shift beneath her feet. Then, like a volcano erupting, the shock gave way to rage. "What? You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire terminal. Heads turned, passengers waiting for their flights lifted their heads from their phones, people from different gates peered over, curious, some already had their cameras out, recognizing her as the woman who was just kicked off that flight. The executive, completely unfazed, gave a slow, measured nod. "Actually, we can." He tilted his head slightly. "And we just did." Eleanor's entire body shook, her fists clenched, her face turning a shade of red that almost looked unnatural. "You think I'm just going to accept this? I have connections. I'll have your job for this." Passengers watching gasped and muttered, some started laughing because Eleanor sounded ridiculous, and the executive looked downright bored. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his tone not changing in the slightest, "this airline has a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, discrimination, and unruly behavior. Your actions today have resulted in a permanent travel ban across all our flights, effective immediately. You will receive an official notice via email, and any attempt to book a future ticket will be automatically declined." Eleanor was shaking now, the reality was finally sinking in. "No," she screamed, stomping her foot like a child. "No. No. I'm the victim here." People in the terminal openly laughed now. A teenager whispered to her friend, "Does she actually think this is helping?" A middle-aged woman scoffed, shaking her head, "She did this to herself, and they were recording it, and it was already spreading." Eleanor, for the second time today, had created her own downfall, and this time there was no recovering from it. The executive, clearly done with her tantrum, motioned to security. "Please escort Ms. Whitmore out of the terminal." Eleanor gasped, horrified. "No. You can't. I have a flight to catch. I have places to be." One of the security officers calmly took her by the arm. "Not on this airline, ma'am." And just like that, Eleanor van der Linde, the woman who thought she ruled first class, the woman who had spent her entire life demanding special treatment, the woman who had tried to remove the CEO of the airline from her own flight, was now being dragged out of the airport like an unruly child. Passengers in the waiting area clapped, some even cheered. A businessman shook his head with a chuckle. "I love to see karma in real time." A woman whispered to her friend, "She's definitely going viral." And Eleanor, her final words before she disappeared from sight, "I'll sue you. I'll sue this whole airline. This isn't over." But even she knew it was over because she wasn't just kicked off a flight, she wasn't just humiliated, she wasn't just banned from an airline, she had been exposed, and in the age of social media, that was something she would never escape. The world had turned against her, now she was a joke, her name was everywhere. News outlets had picked up the story within hours, the viral clips of her tantrum on the plane, her screaming meltdown at the gate, and the smug confidence draining from her face when she learned who Serena Sinclair really was. All of it had spread across every social media platform imaginable. People were dissecting her every word, her every action. They weren't just talking about the flight, they were digging into her past. And Eleanor, she was losing everything. Her inbox was flooded with angry emails, she had been let go from multiple business engagements, brands she had partnered with were cutting ties, Her family was receiving messages from reporters asking for statements. She had gone from living a life of privilege to becoming one of the most hated women on the internet. And now she had one option left: the apology. The camera clicked on a dimly lit room. Amanda sat in front of a blank wall, her face bare, her eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be hours of crying. She sniffled, wiping at her cheek, her breath shaky as she looked directly into the lens. "I made a terrible mistake," she took a deep, trembling breath. "I was wrong," her voice cracked at just the right moment. "I let my ignorance cloud my judgment. I never meant to hurt anyone, but I see now that my actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility." A single tear slipped down her cheek. She let it stay there, the dramatic pause, the perfect balance of remorse and fragility. She had studied apology videos before, she knew exactly how to make herself look like the victim. "Miss Sinclair," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I deeply regret how I treated you. I don't know what came over me. I was overwhelmed, I was frustrated, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. You didn't deserve that, no one does." She exhaled shakily, as if the weight of her actions was just now hitting her. "I spent the last few days reflecting, and I realize now that I need to change, I need to listen, I need to learn, and I promise to do better." Her lips trembled. I hope the world can find it in their hearts to forgive me." Her voice faded into silence. She let the weight of her words linger, then with a final broken breath, she ended the video. She posted it within minutes. The caption read, "I'm truly sorry, please take the time to watch this and understand my heart." For a moment she sat back watching the screen, waiting. Would people accept it? Would they finally stop attacking her? Would she get her life back? The first comment came in, then the second, then the flood began, and Eleanor's stomach dropped because instead of sympathy, instead of support, instead of forgiveness, she saw this: "Nah, you're just sorry you got caught. We don't believe you. You had no remorse when you threw that bag and tried to get her arrested. Too little, too late." Classic PR apology: zero emotion, zero sincerity, zero accountability. The likes on those comments skyrocketed, more poured in, people mocked her, dissected her video, called out her forced tears, pointed out how she was still making it about herself. Memes exploded. Someone posted a compilation of her apology mixed with her screaming on the plane, another edited the video to add fake Oscar-winning music behind her performance. One tweet went viral: "If you ever feel bad about your mistakes, just remember that Eleanor van der Linde thought she could fake cry her way out of this mess and made it even worse." Over 1 million likes. Eleanor felt sick. She had hoped that this would be enough, but the world had made up its mind. Her apology wasn't an apology, it was damage control, and nobody was buying it. The downfall of Eleanor van der Linde was officially complete. But that downfall wasn't just the end of an individual. It was also the beginning of a larger conversation about power, about discrimination, about the deeply ingrained biases we often carry without realizing. Serena Sinclair, after all, didn't gloat over Eleanor's downfall. She returned to her work, continuing to run the airline with her usual composure and determination. But she also understood that her story had become a symbol, a reminder that no one has the right to judge others based on appearances or personal prejudices. In the days that followed, discussions erupted across the media. People talked about racial discrimination, about the abuse of power, about the invisible privileges some people enjoy. Those who had been silent in the face of injustice began to speak up. Those who had harbored biases began to re-examine themselves. Eleanor van der Linde, after days of living in isolation and resentment, finally understood that an apology wasn't a magic key to unlock forgiveness. It was just a starting point, an acknowledgement that she was wrong. She began to seek out organizations that worked for equality, participated in volunteer activities, trying to make up for the harm she had caused. Her path to redemption was long and arduous, but at least she had begun to walk that path. The story of Eleanor van der Linde and Serena Sinclair wasn't just a lesson in fairness, but also a reminder that, in today's world, no one can escape responsibility for their actions. Social media, with its immense power to spread, can be a double-edged sword, both exposing the truth and punishing the wicked. But above all, it's a tool for us to build a more just and civilized society together.